So Superman 2 is a bit of a mess, and arrogantly fixing this movie is not going to be as easy as it was fixing the first Superman movie. With the first movie, the overall basic structure remained the same, even though I made a lot of changes to the movie. But with this movie, I'm going to be making a lot of really big changes, which is going to necessitate a lot of rewrites throughout the video. And on top of that, I'm also turning this into a sequel of my version of Superman the movie, which you should totally go watch, by the way. You know, if you want to. So anyway, it's going to be a little bit trickier fixing any of the problems in this movie than it was in the first movie, but I think that it can be done. So here we go. So first thing I'm getting rid of here is Lex Luthor. Luthor doesn't actually do anything worthwhile in this movie other than tell Zod that the son of Jor-El is Superman, which is something Zod could have figured out on his own. So no Luthor here. He can stay in jail and we can let this be Zod's movie. And while the Luthor stuff doesn't make up a huge part of the movie, the next bit that we'll be eliminating makes up about half the movie, so buckle up. I absolutely hate the Superman giving up his powers to be with Lois plot. For one thing, we've already reduced the importance of Jor-El and Lara in the first movie because Superman is a grown man and doesn't need the approval of his ghost parents on who he can date. But also, the whole thing comes from such a weird place that I've never understood. I hear people all the time talk about how Superman is duty-bound to protect the planet, and him marrying Lois is selfish because Superman doesn't belong to one person, but the whole world. And wow, what a load of garbage. As I mentioned in my video fixing Superman the movie, Superman is just a normal guy from Kansas. While he is certainly willing to live and die for the people of his adopted homeworld, that doesn't mean that he is obligated to do so. If he wants to settle down and marry a fine young woman like Lois Lane, then why shouldn't he? I guess the argument that people use is that while he's canoodling Lois, that someone is dying somewhere. But that's also true for whenever he's visiting home eating apple pie with Ma Kent, or when he's typing a story at the Daily Planet. There's no reason why him getting with Lois should get in the way of what he is already doing. And it's not the same song and dance that we see a lot of times where the hero is afraid the villains will get to him through the love interest. This movie has Superman willing to give up his powers to be with Lois, and there's no mention of any villains who could strike at Superman through Lois. The entire through line of this movie seems to be that for Superman to be Superman, he must forego any and all happiness, and I just don't understand or agree with that line of thinking. This whole chunk of the movie comes from such a wrong mentality that I wouldn't even know how to salvage any of this. So that, coupled with the Luthor stuff being cut, means that I need to come up with something brand new for like 2/3 of this movie. So with those huge parts of the movie gone, let's get into it scene by scene. We'll begin the movie on Krypton with Zod and his cronies attempting a coup and quickly being outnumbered. The scene in the movie we got is perfectly fine, so we'll basically use that scene. Then you can do your opening credits and then cut to Superman throwing a missile into space from the first movie, and its explosion releases Zod and his cronies from the Phantom Zone. And instead of a pane of glass floating through space, I'd have the criminals placed in a small spacecraft that was then launched into an alternate dimension through some exchange of large amounts of energy. Cue incomprehensible technobabble. This is largely because of another change that I would be making. Zod and his cronies are not at full power when they first arrive on Earth, since they only just began absorbing yellow solar radiation. They will become more powerful throughout the movie, but they don't immediately have Superman's powers when they arrive on Earth. As such, it doesn't make much sense for them to have come out of the Phantom Zone in outer space unprotected. So the H-bomb has roughly the same amount of energy exchange to open the gate to the Phantom Zone again, allowing the Kryptonian craft to come into our dimension and land on Earth. So I'd also be cutting the landing on the moon and the planet Houston misunderstanding. There's no way they would be able to land on the moon, exit from their craft, and kill the astronauts and figure out how to fly their ship back to Earth. Now you see what I meant when I said that I had a whole lot more fixing to do with this movie. Even though Superman disposing of the bombs at the end of the first movie will be our method of releasing Zod and friends from the Phantom Zone, we will still be using the scene with the terrorists in Paris from the theatrical cut, but we will be changing everything about that. Instead of Paris, it's Metropolis. Instead of terrorists, it's a new gang rising up to replace Luthor and his gang after his public fall from grace. We will call this group Intergang. And instead of an H-bomb, it's a solar energy core reactor thingy at Star Labs. Cue incomprehensible technobabble. Star Labs is trying to invent a clean, cheap, renewable energy source, but this device can also be weaponized with high-concentrated energy blasts, which obviously interests Intergang. After Superman deals with the Intergangsters and Star gets their machine back, he flies off and Clark comes back with some flimsy excuse for where he's been. As we found out at the end of my fix for the first Superman movie, Lois already strongly suspects that Clark is Superman, so we'll need to have her pursue that a lot sooner than what she did in the theatrical cut. The Donner cut is a little better because it opens with Lois testing Clark by jumping out of a window of the Daily Planet. But the problem with the Donner cut is that it takes Lois 3 attempts to finally expose Clark's secret, and we don't need to waste valuable screen time on this subplot when one attempt should do the trick. Instead of jumping into the water at Niagara Falls or jumping out of a building, we'll go with the scene where Lois pulls a gun on Clark because it really is clever and it's much less dangerous for Lois. So when Lois confirms that Clark is Superman, they'll naturally want to have a talk. But I would slow down on them jumping into bed as soon as she finds out. Sure, I'm a prude, but even so, it seems a little soon. We don't really know how much time passes sequences in between the first movie and the Lester cut, but with the Donner cut using the end of the first movie to kickstart the plot of this movie, and me doing the same thing here, it makes me think that Clark and Lois haven't really known each other that long. Definitely not long enough for them to be saying that they love each other, at least not yet. And yeah, Lois is enamored with Superman almost as soon as he shows up on the scene, but not enough to drop her panties as soon as she finds out who he really is. But they'll still want to have a long talk because there's still a lot Lois doesn't understand about Superman, especially now that she knows he spends a lot of his time as a mere mortal. They'll still have their talk at the Fortress of Solitude. This will be important later. This would be a cool scene for her to kind of take him to task for basically lying to everyone at the Daily Planet, especially since one of Superman's first exchanges with Lois was when he told her that he never lied. But then 90% of his excuses of why Clark wasn't there when Superman showed up are lies, so this would be a chance for Lois and Superman to really get to know each other. No mask, so to speak. He isn't wearing the goofball Metropolis facade that Lois has always known, nor is he wearing the square-jawed Superman role model mask that surely must get tiring for him after a while. And this would be Clark's chance to explain all of that to Lois. Why he has to stop being Superman from time to time and just live as a mortal. Not just to give himself a recharge, but also to be part of this world. If he was just Superman all the time, he would lose touch with his roots that he had growing up before he became Superman. And while this scene wouldn't culminate in Lois and Clark sleeping together, at least not yet, we can still dabble in the romance in this scene. Lois, ever the reporter, can be asking him questions that nobody else would have the chance to ask him. Do you ever see yourself settling down, having kids? Can you have kids? And maybe Clark, initially, is kinda a stand-in for the people who think that Superman getting married is a betrayal of his duty as Superman. Clark tells Lois about how his dad said that he was put on this planet for a reason, and Clark took that to mean that he needed to spend as much time as he could saving the world, and if he settles down with someone, he's betraying his dad's final words to him. This kinda takes Lois aback, and for the first time in a long time, she's speechless. Later in the movie, we can have Clark realize that he doesn't have to take this quite so literally, and he can still save the world while also pursuing his social life. Meanwhile, we'll cut to the Kryptonian exile ship landing somewhere in the middle of nowhere, with the three figures we saw being banished at the beginning of the movie emerging. But like I said, they don't immediately have their powers yet. One thing I'd like to explore with Zod is his military background. I love Terrence Stamp's portrayal, but it's not quite right for this character. He acts like someone who has been king for a long time, and not someone who just recently, relatively speaking, tried to become king. We should see more of the military attitude in him. As soon as they land, they start strategizing. We need to get our bearings, find the locals. Are they hostile? Can we realistically take them on? What is their technology like? Can we find a way back home? Because once they're in the Phantom Zone, they would have no way of knowing that Krypton was destroyed, or how much time has even passed. Furthermore, in the Lester cut, Zod kinda patronizes Superman for building a monument to the dead world of Krypton in the Fortress of Solitude, but I don't really like that. Zod is a bad guy, sure, but he can have human moments also, right? When Zod finds out Krypton was destroyed, I'd love to see him tear up a little bit as he realizes that he's lost everything. Sure, he still wants to subjugate all of humanity by force, but he can still have tender moments too. Anyway, it's in the very early reconnaissance of Earth that Non will find a newspaper featuring Superman on the front page. I would make Non just a little bit less stupid than he was in the movies. He can have moments where he figures stuff out just like Zod and Ursa did in the movies. He can still be mute, but that doesn't mean that he has to be just the third wheel that Zod and Ursa tolerate. So when Non breaks the newspaper kiosk, some cops try to arrest him and he resists arrest, and one of the cops shoots him. And it hurts a lot, but it doesn't break the skin. Non is pretty badly bruised, and he definitely doesn't want to be shot again, but as he notices the shock on the faces of his enemies, he quickly understands that he is more powerful than the natives of this world. Non brings the newspaper back to Zod and Ursa, and they both gasp as they see the S symbol on the front page. They all recognize the symbol of the House of El, and Zod, clenching his teeth, mutters, "The son of Jor-El. We will have our revenge." We cut back to Lois and Clark having their conversation, and they come to an understanding. Lois isn't going to tell the world Clark's secret, despite her reporter's instinct, because the world needs Superman, and taking away his Clark Kent persona will only make his life more challenging as Superman because, like he said, sometimes he needs some time off to recharge. Lois even offers to help Clark come up with better excuses for whenever he needs to do his Superman thing. She teases Clark that some of his lies were pretty bad, to which Clark teases that they were good enough to fool her. This conversation is then interrupted by a very loud ultrasonic noise. Clark leaves to investigate, only to find that it is Intergang luring him into a trap. We also see Zod, Ursa, and Non, wherever they landed, hearing the noise and making tall leaps toward the source of it. Superman begins fighting the Intergangsters, but they're able to hold him off a little bit by overstimulating his senses with loud noises and bright flashes of light. But Superman eventually defeats them, or at least defeats the ones who stuck around. Superman flies away, and from a distance, Zod and friends were watching the whole thing with their own slowly developing supervision. And later that day, at the Daily Planet, Clark and Lois find out that while Superman was distracted by Intergang on the other end of town, another group of Intergangsters made another pass at the Solar Energy Core reactor thingy at Star Labs, and this time they actually got it. Intergang is now making hostage demands on TV key. Any city in the world could be destroyed by a long-distance blast from the solar energy core reactor thingy unless they get their money. And just to prove that they're not lying, Intergang sends a solar blast to some small town somewhere. Superman races to stop the blast from destroying the town and probably uses a school bus or something to deflect the blast. And when Superman makes it back to Metropolis and scans the city to find out where the blast came from, he finds their hideout, as well as 3 mysterious figures dressed in black and the members of Intergang unconscious on the floor. Zod addresses Superman as Son of Jor-El, and Superman knows something is up. While Superman knew the name of his biological father from the brief message that was left in his spaceship, he never told anyone about that, not even Lois in the interview that she did with him in the previous movie. But before Superman can figure out what these 3 want, Non punches him, knocking him across the room. If he had been fully powered, the punch would have thrown him across the city. But still, now Superman definitely knows something is up, because any human couldn't have thrown that punch. By now, Zod is monologuing, talking about how they lost their entire planet thanks to Jor-El refusing to allow them to take control of the leading council of Krypton and fix what they would not fix. Your father threw us into that hell and allowed our planet to be destroyed, and now we will see how you like it. Ursa turns the machine on a lower setting, bathing all of them in yellow solar radiation. Superman gets up, feeling rejuvenated, but not for long. I know in the late 1970s, special effects weren't as incredible as they are now, but this scene really needs to feel more visceral than it did in either the Donner cut or the Lester cut. No cellophane S-throwing, no weird hologram tag, no taking on Superman one at a time. All 3 of them just start wailing on Superman, and he can barely get one punch in. Then, with Superman barely conscious, Zod takes out this weird mirror-looking thing that was on their capsule they were in when they were banished into the Phantom Zone. He hangs it on Superman's neck, and they turn up the intensity of the solar energy core reactor thingy, aiming it directly at the mirror. And then do some weird film-negative special effects thing, and Superman is in the Phantom Zone. From here, we do what the movie did with Zod, Ursa, and Non invading the White House and taking control of the country. Instead of sending a broadcast offering Superman to challenge them, they instead want to tell the world that Superman is dead. Long live the Superman. Oh, and I really love the "I see you are practiced in worshipping things that fly" line, so we'll keep that. But we'll save the kneel before Zod bit for the 3rd act. So then Lois finds the Intergang warehouse because there was so much damage there, and she finds the mirror thing on the ground. She remembers Superman telling her about everything he studied about the history of his planet, and how they didn't have a death penalty, but they did have access to an alternate dimension that could be opened with a huge expenditure of energy. And hey, what do you know? The solar energy core reactor thingy is right here in this warehouse. Lois turns the machine on full blast and aims it at the mirror thing and frees Superman. After a quick sunbathing to heal his wounds, Superman is ready for round 2. Then we'll get another big fight scene. This time, we can have more spectacle across an entire city like the movie did. Superman mostly seems to be distracting them, and finally he's able to get them close together, and he signals to Lois, who fires the solar energy core reactor thingy at them. But this time, it's firing red solar radiation. So we more or less end the threat of the Phantom Zone criminals in the same way the movie did, just with an Earth-made machine instead of the Fortress. But instead of Lois and Superman killing Zod and Ursa like they did in both cuts of Superman 2, we'll just have the police or the FBI arrest the 3 Phantom Zone criminals. Now, I have problems with how both the Donner cut and the Lester cut take things from there. The Donner cut uses the spinning around the planet to reverse time bit that he originally planned to use for Superman 2 anyway, and I've already talked about how that's a narrative cheat and it's incredibly unsatisfying. The Lester cut uses a super kiss that somehow gives Lois amnesia so that she doesn't remember finding out that Clark is Superman, or sleeping with him for that matter. And I don't like this either. It's just as bad as turning the planet backward in time, because it provides a way for Superman to not have to face the consequences of his actions. In fact, we even see him employ the super kiss again in Superman 4 for no reason other than he wanted to talk to someone about his problems. If the movie feels the need to break the status quo by having Lois find out that Clark is Superman, then the movie can live with the status quo being broken or at least permanently bent. Personally, I don't have a problem with Lois knowing Clark's secret at the end of the movie and then progressing from there in future potential sequels. In fact, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were going to do something a lot like this back in the 1940s, but changed their minds. So even though this predates Lois finding out Clark's secret in the comics for good by a good 15 years, I still think that this would have been fine to use here. Lastly, I would want to end on a slightly less bright and positive note. I don't have a problem with optimism, especially in a Superman movie, but after everything Zod and his friends did, the people should be just a little bit afraid of Superman and what he can do. Yeah, he wasn't the one trying to take over the planet, but now they see that he could if he wanted to. Now, I wouldn't ever want to actually explore this idea. We've seen that a lot in the past 15 years or so, and to be kind of honest, I'm sick of it. But nonetheless, the people are maybe going to be a little bit afraid. We'll see Star Labs scientists putting a chunk of kryptonite in a safe and putting extra security details on the solar energy core reactor thing thingy, as well as installing red solar lamps throughout their facility. All the while, we'll be hearing Superman talk to the president, kind of sort of like he did in the movie, telling him that yes, this was a scary experience for everyone, just as it was for Superman. Superman saw what he could be capable of, but he assures the president and the rest of the world that he was raised human, and that's what he sees himself as. Not as an alien god, as Zod and his friends did, but just an ordinary human who wants to do everything that he can to help. The president looks at Superman, maybe a little unsure, but smiles and thanks Superman for everything he's done. And then you have Superman flying out towards the camera. Cue credits. So yeah, that's quite a bit different than the movie that we got, but personally I think that it's an improvement. It doesn't fundamentally betray the concepts or characters of the character or the world of Superman like I feel like the movie does, but it does keep some of the core elements of the movie, even if it rearranges some of those elements in different ways. And that's how I would fix Superman 2. Hope that you guys enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it, and if you did like this, stick around because I'll probably be doing some fixes of other superhero movies in the future. In the meantime, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and stick around. I'll see you later. Have a good one.